you, everyone, and thank you for coming out today, Miigwech. I'd like to acknowledge the Mississaugas of the New Credit, whose traditional territory we are on today. I would also like to pay respects to all our ancestors and to the elders.
Turn your mic.
Thank you. I'm Anishinaabe from Gashgazaga, Anishinaabek. It is a tradition and my custom to acknowledge our parents. My father is Fred Nowgesic, and my mother is Deanna Nowgesic. My parents are Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe. Both attended Aboriginal residential schools, and despite the legacy of the Aboriginal residential school system, my parents persevered in keeping true to their cultural traditions and ultimately passing these values down to me and my three sisters. I'm committed to social justice for and self-determination of Indigenous peoples. I have advocated for the rights of Indigenous peoples. I believe that research involving Indigenous peoples must lead to social change in their best interests. Over the next hour or so, I would like to explain what critical Indigenous qualitative research is and what are its methodological implications. In this regard, the term Indigenous I'm using is synonymous with Aboriginal. There's 3 Aboriginal subgroups in Canada: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. I'd like to acknowledge some of my professors that I learned qualitative inquiry over the years. I'm a recent graduate of the Dalla School of Public Health, Social and Behavioural Health Sciences program. I'd like to thank and acknowledge Dr. Joan Eakin and Dr. Brenda Gladstone, and there's others as well. Before I begin, I would like to go over some of the determinants of health for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And this is important, you'll see, particularly since we're speaking of critical Indigenous qualitative research. The Indian Act governs First Nations. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Indian Act. The Indian Act did not allow First Nations to leave their First Nation reserves without permission of the Indian agent. And I recall my father telling me when I was young, Earl, my reserve is my prison. And I didn't know quite what he meant by that until later in life. And how I interpreted what he was telling me was just this, is that he wasn't allowed to leave his reserve without the permission of the Indian agent. Also, the Indian Act did not allow First Nations to vote in federal elections. The only way that First Nations could do such things was through enfranchisement. Enfranchisement is a legal process terminating one's First Nation status and giving up one's treaty rights. Enfranchisement automatically occurred if status First Nations, for example, joined the Canadian Armed Forces, went to university, and for status First Nations women when they marry non-First Nations men. Through amendments to the Indian Act, such paternalistic restrictions have been abolished. The Indian Act is also responsible for the creation of Aboriginal residential schools. Aboriginal residential schools were created according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, quote, for the purpose of separating Aboriginal children from their families in order to minimize and weaken family ties and cultural linkages, and to indoctrinate children into a new culture, the culture of the legally dominant Euro-Christian Canadian society, end of quote. In 1991, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, or RCAP, was established to investigate Aboriginal issues, including the Aboriginal residential school legacy in Canada. The RCAP concluded that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations needed to be restructured. For over 100 years and up until the 1990s, tens of thousands of Indigenous or Aboriginal children attended Canadian federal government-supported Aboriginal residential schools to be indoctrinated into Canada's Euro-Christian society. This is according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I can't stress that enough. The impact that that had on Indigenous populations in Canada. The Royal Commission as I mentioned, concluded that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal relations needed to be restructured. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established in 2008 to acknowledge Aboriginal residential schools, the experiences, and to contribute to reconciliation. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report, which includes 94 calls to action. I'd like to share with you research from Dr. Grace Getty. In 2010, she conducted research with First Nations, specifically Mi'kmaq men in the East Coast. And she was using, for her research, a post-colonial framework. And upon her own reflection, she decided that she needed to abandon this framework. It was based on her own experience as, quote unquote, a white researcher. And what she did was she replaced the initial post-colonial framework that she was using with a critical Indigenous framework, using a Mi'kmaq ontology and epistemology to emancipate the Mi'kmaq. For example, Mi'kmaq self-determination from hegemonic groups. Ontologies and epistemologies. According to Giacomin, ontologies are beliefs about the basic entities that make up reality. Epistemologies can be thought of colloquially in the form of the question, how do we know what we know? I'd like to share with you a quotation from a study I conducted called the Indigenous Red Ribbon Storytelling Study. The purpose of the study, ultimately, was intended to provide a benefit to Indigenous communities. The research question for the study was, how do Indigenous peoples living with HIV construct and understand their experiences with antiretroviral therapy? This was one participant who shared with me her thoughts. To respect the participants' privacies, I didn't use their real names. This is a nominal code that I assigned to people arbitrarily. So this participant, the code that I assigned to her is Inding. And what she said to me was, that's why I'm glad that I met the Indigenous elder here today, because I wanted to meet an elder. There's so much stuff that I wanted to do, but I just don't know how to go about doing it. So the significance of what this participant was sharing with me is that based on her ontology and her experiences, she wanted a connection with her culture. And she wanted to experience life according to that lens. But she didn't know how would she go about doing it. And this was the first time when she participated in my study that she met an elder, a First Nation elder. And it meant a lot to her. So what I would like you to do is think about the terms, the definitions that we just went over in terms of ontologies and epistemologies, and the significance of those definitions within the context of this quotation. Now, as most of you know, I'm sure, and are familiar with the critical social paradigm. According to Giacometti, Guba, and Lincoln, a critical social paradigm has an idealistic ontology based upon historical realism. It has a subjectivist, transactional epistemology. And the findings are ultimately determined by weighing the values of people in a particular time and place. According to Denzin and Lincoln, in an Indigenous context, a critical social paradigm has, quote, it has failed, quote, to address how Indigenous cultures and their epistemologies were sites of resistance and empowerment, end of quote. So let's try to understand this a bit more. According to Bishop, Smith, and Smith, who are involved in Ko Papamari research, which is a New Zealand Indigenous initiative, they state that Ko Papamari research preferences, quote, the need to recognize and address the ongoing effects of racism and colonialism in the wider society, end of quote. Ko Papamari research privileges practices with an Indigenous viewpoint by focusing values within an Indigenous-centered research paradigm. Quote, according to Smith, It is a local theoretical positioning, which is the modality through which the emancipatory goal of critical theory is practiced. End of quote. Now, some of the challenges of critical social paradigm within the context of conducting research with Indigenous peoples is using a critical social paradigm, incorporating Indigenous-centered research paradigm into a critical social paradigm. And when we do this, this is characterized in relation to its approach to decolonizing methodologies. However, according to Kovac, when we do this, this is consistent with the theoretical underpinnings of Western critical approaches. So again, I would like you to think about the implications here in terms of ontologies and epistemologies of different paradigms. I'd like to share with you another quote from the study that I mentioned. This relates to the Aboriginal residential school legacy and its effect on trust and self-help. Klom shared with me. He said, "Earl, Aboriginal residential school really did affect me a lot. I couldn't believe some of the stuff I went through, especially when you get taken away from your own family. I wasn't even 6 years old, and when they came and got me, and my older brother just literally took us away. Priests, none, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and social service come get you in the fall, bring you back in the spring. You get to go home. You're not allowed to talk to your own language. I could talk 5 languages when I was a kid. Now I could only talk one dialect of Cree." Klum also shared with me, healthcare providers are more pushy than ever. They demand that you take antiretrovirals. Now, the importance of this quotation is you'll recognize the lens that we're using here, a critical social paradigm. Now let's shift a bit to an Indigenous research paradigm. An Indigenous research paradigm, according to Wilson, is non-Western in terms of its ideologies. Its ontology and epistemology are defined by Indigenous cultures. It has a relational ontology and a relational epistemology. Indigenous research paradigm utilizes interpretive research methods that are appropriate to the lived experiences, including the culture, language, and traditional values of Indigenous people. And that last bit of information is according to Baskin, Denson, and Lincoln. What are some of the challenges of Indigenous research paradigm? Although, and this is according to, again, Baskin, Lavallee, Roth, Ojibwe, and Carroll. Some of the challenges of Indigenous research paradigm is, although an Indigenous research paradigm is not commonly used in the Academy of Health Sciences, it is gaining some traction. Indigenous research paradigm methodologies are not fleshed out enough in the existing literature. Now, if we look at the critical Indigenous pedagogy, vis-a-vis critical Indigenous qualitative research, according to Denson and Lincoln, what this is it's the connection between critical methodologies and Indigenous methodologies, where research is political and moral and aims to attain social justice. It gives greater value to Indigenous subjugated knowledge, and its ability to transform social structures to support Indigenous peoples. A critical Indigenous pedagogy, according to Denzin and Lincoln, quote, embraces the commitment by Indigenous scholars to decolonize Western methodologies, to criticize and demystify the way in which Western science and the modern academy have been part of the colonial apparatus. End quote. According to Smith, quote, decolonization does not mean and has not meant a total rejection of all theory or research or Western knowledge. Rather, it's about centering Indigenous peoples' concerns and worldviews in the coming to know and understand theory and research from Indigenous peoples' own perspectives and Indigenous peoples' own purposes, for their own purposes. That's according to Smith. What are some of the challenges of critical Indigenous qualitative research? Denzin and Lincoln tells us, quote, first, the legacy of the helping Western colonizing other must be resisted. Second, critical interpretive performance theory and critical race theory without modification will not work within Indigenous settings. Critical theory must be localized, grounded in the specific meanings, traditions, customs, and community relations that operate in each Indigenous setting. And third, culturally responsive research practices must be developed. Such practices would locate power within the Indigenous community. Okay, so what are some of the methodological implications of critical Indigenous qualitative research? As I mentioned, Indigenous research methods have not been described enough in the scholarly literature. What I would like to share with you for the remainder of the presentation is how I operationalize critical Indigenous qualitative research. I'll use the Indigenous Red Ribbon Storytelling Study as an example. And again, the research question of this study was, how do Indigenous peoples living with HIV construct and understand their experiences pertaining antiretroviral therapy? There was 11 community partners in Saskatchewan, where the study took place, that worked closely with me. I would like to give an overview of the methods that I used in the study, and I'll elaborate on them for the remainder of the presentation. I'd like to share with you now that community-based participatory research is commonly used in Indigenous health research. And this is important. Some of the methods that were used in this study were Indigenous sharing circles, storytelling through individual interviews, and cultural practices of Indigenous peoples. Such as tobacco offerings, the involvement of elders, smudging, traditional Indigenous gift giving, and Indigenous feasts. According to Baskin, Lavallee, Roth, and Wilson, an Indigenous sharing circle is a form of focus group interview appropriate to Indigenous people. The method here is relevant to Indigenous cultural reality that provides a means to exchange knowledge in a sacred way that is respectful of this culture. This is according to Lavallee. According to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, they describe the concept of sacred space. Now, what I would like you to do is to think about an Indigenous sharing circle within the context of sacred space. And the Canadian Institutes of Health Research tells us that what sacred space is, quote, the relationship between the individual and a recognized spiritual identity, the land, kinship networks, including all plant and animal life and ancestors. This relationship is both spatial, where the individual is inclusive of the family and the community, and temporal, where the present generation is inclusive of past and future generations. In this sacred space, there is an interconnectedness founded on purity, clarity, peace, generosity, and responsibility between the recognized spiritual entity, the land, and the ancestors, end of quote. The use of Indigenous elders, involving elders in research. Research involving Indigenous peoples. According to King, Smith, and Gracie, elders are people from the culture who have Indigenous ancestry. They are leaders in the community. They are recognized and respected by community members to be leaders. According to the National Aboriginal Health Organization and Wright et al., they tell us what smudging is. And as I mentioned, smudging was used as a method in the study. They tell us that smudging is a cultural ceremony commonly practiced among Indigenous peoples. Traditional medicinal plants and herbs are burned in order to spiritually connect one with the Creator and Mother Earth. Smudging is used, according to Baskin, McKay, McNabb. It's used in social sciences and HIV/AIDS studies involving Indigenous peoples. The Indigenous elders that were involved in the study, they were present during the interviews, during the individual interviews and the Indigenous Sharing Circle interviews. For the individual interviews, they were present at the beginning of the interview, then they would leave, and then at the end of the interview, they might have came back. depending on the study participant and the environment and the situation. During the Indigenous Sharing Circle interviews, the Indigenous elders were present for the whole interview. The beginning, the duration of the interview, and the end. The elders would start off the interviews with a prayer, with smudging, and they would help to end the interview also. Now, when the elders were involved in the study, out of respect for them and what they were sharing with us in the study, they were sharing with us traditional knowledge, sacred knowledge. And again, I'd like you to think about the terms that I mentioned, ontology and epistemology, as it relates to this. So, when they were sharing traditional knowledge, out of that respect that I had, I would turn off the audio recorder. The audio recorder that was used to record the interviews. And then once the elders finished sharing with us, myself and the study participants, I would turn back on the audio recorder. Now I would like you to think about epistemology. Within the context of the use of Indigenous elders and smudging. And at times, depending on where the interview took place, the logistics of the environment, the physical environment, and possibly the social environment, sometimes made it impossible to open the interviews with smudging. When smudging was offered, not all participants accepted the ceremonial practice. So in that regard, I would like you to think about ontology. And for those who did accept smudging, made a point of commenting on the respectful, communal, even intimate element it brought to a confidential interview. So in this regard, I would like you to think about epistemology now. So as I mentioned, critical Indigenous qualitative research preferences, it gives preference to Indigenous subjugated knowledge. According to Baskin, an Indigenous research paradigm is based upon the component sets of physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual relationships. So what I would like you to do now is think about an Indigenous research paradigm and its ontology and epistemology, which is relational. I'd like to share with you another quotation from the study, and this is in terms of adhering to interpretative therapy, the consolations of faith, hope, and spiritual practices. Now this quotation, I'll read it in a minute. While I'm doing that, I would like you to think about the relational ontology of an Indigenous research paradigm. So the study participant, Reth, he said to me, Earl, the most important thing, what I would like for doctors, is to incorporate that spiritual, mental, and physical, especially with natives. I think that would go a long way. Well, let's ask the Creator. Let's sit down and bring an elder in, or a pastor. Whatever the person's spirituality is. I know that nurses incorporate, like mental health and addiction nurses, which is good. And I think a person needs to have a full circle walk just to keep them balanced. So you can see from this quotation that what was important to Reth and what he was sharing with me was the connections among the spiritual, mental, and physical domains of himself. And I should say that all the study participants were of Indigenous ancestry. First Nations and Métis. Okay, so we've been doing a lot of thinking for the past half hour or so. Now I'd like to go back to the example that we talked about with Dr. Grace Getty when she conducted her research with First Nations men in the East Coast, Mi'kmaq men. And Getty tells us, quote, unless the critical social theory being used as a lens through which to view the research data is based on Indigenous systems of knowledge and philosophical approaches to issues, the research process could in fact miss what is most relevant to Aboriginal people, end of quote. So what I would like you to think about now is as researchers, when we're conducting research, from a qualitative perspective, naturalistic inquiry, what are we trying to accomplish when we conduct such research? What are we trying to understand and explain? in terms of the phenomenon under study. So with this in mind, Getty, she abandoned her original theoretical approach partway through her study of an indigenous population. And as you recall, she used a post-colonial framework initially in her study. And she replaced it with a critical indigenous lens. Now, going back to the Indigenous Red Ribbon storytelling study that I conducted, and again, the purpose of the study was to understand how Indigenous peoples living with HIV understand and construct their experiences of antiretroviral therapy use. One concept that was noteworthy in the study was spirituality, the notion of spirituality. What I would like you to do now is to tie this notion of spirituality to how study participants viewed who they are and their life circumstances to antiretroviral therapy use. According to Ojibwe, culture and Indigenous spirituality, quote, "It is the intimate relationship that Indigenous people establish with place and with the environment and with all of the things that make them or give them life." End of quote. So what I would like you to think about now is the Indigenous research paradigm, ontology and epistemology, which is relational. In the study that I conducted, the Indigenous Red Ribbon Storytelling Study, the findings of the study was consistent with what others have found. Milligan and Lavoie, in their study, they found that Indigenous peoples living with HIV who had a disconnection from spirituality had a difficult time adhering to antiretroviral therapy. Kaup and Muller, what they found in their study was that spirituality was important. And that Indigenous peoples living with HIV in their study were more likely to adhere to antiretroviral therapy. Participants in their study who identified with the notion of spirituality. Not too long ago, I was invited by the Canadian Nurses Association to sit on an advisory group to help them to develop a policy document. A policy document concerning Aboriginal health nursing and Aboriginal health. They conducted a study looking at a number of factors, issues, phenomenon. And they identified in their policy document 5 priority areas for strategic action. And there was one priority area that was considered primary and foundational to the other priorities. And that was the integration of Indigenous ontology and epistemology. In conclusion, notwithstanding the limitations of both paradigms, the critical social paradigm and an Indigenous research paradigm, I believe that a discussion can take place between the critical social paradigm and the Indigenous research paradigm that will both aid for social change in a way that is more culturally centered on Indigenous peoples and will support the further articulation of a dedicated Indigenous research paradigm. I would like to share with you one concluding experience that I had in the study. And this relates to Wilson. Who published a book called Research as Ceremony. As the title of Dr. Sean Wilson's book makes clear, within the context of research involving Indigenous people, research is ceremony. In this context, any piece of ceremony demands respect. And so when one of my study participants in the study that I conducted, called the Indigenous Red Ribbon Storytelling Study, who I interviewed in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, when he found out that I would be traveling to the city of Prince Albert, which is just located north of Saskatoon. So when he found out that I'd be traveling to the city of Prince Albert to conduct more interviews for the study, he gave me a tobacco bundle. And he asked me to tie it on a tree in his home territory. Prince Albert is his traditional First Nation territory. It is where he felt he belonged. And where he felt grounded. He was offering tobacco as a prayer for other Indigenous peoples living with HIV. I was honored to carry out his respect and felt as if I were not just the agent of his respect, but a ceremonial link in his chain of offering. Since this was the same tobacco bundle that I had offered to him for participating in my study, the Indigenous Red Ribbon Storytelling Study. I often felt that my study was very much research as ceremony. In closing, I would like to acknowledge the study participants, community partners, elders, and thesis committee members who supported my study and provided me with their expertise. I'm also grateful to other groups who provided me with operational approvals, ethics approvals, academic advice, and fellowship support. And I think that I will end there. Thank you.